Hey, 7th grade, welcome to your flipped lesson on the cell membrane. Up until this point, we have been talking about the structure and function of the organelles that make up the cell. This lesson is focused on the structure and function of the cell membrane, which we consider the gatekeeper. It's what allows what is necessary into the cell, and it's what gets rid of all the things the cell does not need. So we're going to take a few moments to talk about the structure. We're going to take a look at this image over here. The structure of the cell membrane, it is a double layer of lipid molecules. As you remember from the last lesson, lipids are that group of organic compounds found in living things. This specific phospholipid is called has two sides. It has a head, which is hydrophilic, and a tail, which is hydrophobic. And hydrophilic means water-loving, and hydrophobic means water-fearing. So whenever these phospholipids come into contact with water, they line up side by side. Their hydrophilic heads line up side by side, and their tails get pulled in and move away from the water. And when we look at this image right here, we can see how this works to actually form the structure of the cell membrane. You can see the outside of the cell here is made up mostly of water, and so is the cytoplasm inside the cell. Okay, so we talked about the human body being made up mostly of water. That's outside and inside of our cell. So if the outside of our cell is made up mostly of water, then when these phospholipids come into contact with that water, you can notice in this image that they line up side by side where their hydrophobic tails get pulled in towards the center away from the water. Now, that's the outside of the cell. On the inside of the cell, where their cytoplasm is also made up mostly of water, those phospholipids do the same thing. They behave in the same way. Their hydrophilic heads are fine with the water, so they just line up side by side where their tails get pulled in again. And this right here is what we call our double layer. Okay, we have our outside hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails, and our inside hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. What you'll also notice here is we have something called protein chains or protein channels, and these function in allowing larger particles to move through the cell. And when we talk about what the function of the cell membrane is, we'll talk more about these transport proteins. But right now, the structure of the cell membrane, to recap, is a double layer of phospholipids. Phospholipids being there we go. Phospholipids being a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail molecule. And those hydrophilic heads lining up side by side in that water environment, and the tails being pulled in, forming that double layer. Okay, so now that we know the structure, let's talk a little bit about what this cell membrane does. And you can also look at this image here for another view of that double lipid membrane. So here we have the phospholipid molecule labeled right here. We have our hydrophilic head and our hydrophobic tails. That is the outside of the cell. And then we also have our hydrophilic head and our hydrophobic tails on the inside of the cell. So we say that, or we call this cell membrane selectively permeable. And what does that mean? It means that it allows only certain things in and out of the cell. Permeable means that things can move through it. But selectively permeable means that things move through in different ways. Okay, so things that the cell needs, some obvious things, well, it needs oxygen for cellular respiration. It also needs water for cellular respiration. It needs glucose for cellular respiration, and salt. Okay, the things that it needs to get rid of, well, it needs to get rid of the waste products of cellular respiration, which is carbon dioxide. It also needs to get rid of worn out cell parts. And then we talked about those organelles, the ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus that make and package those proteins. Well, those proteins need to get out of the cell. And so part of the membrane is made up of protein channels that allow this to happen. So the cell membrane is selectively permeable, letting only certain things in and out in very specific ways. And what are some of those ways? So the first ones we'll talk about, and a lot of our lab this week will be focused on this one, is diffusion and osmosis. So these are new words for you. And what diffusion is, it is a kind of a behavior of particles. So particles will move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. And you can actually do a little test with this. So particles move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. If you have some Lysol or perfume, if you go to one corner of your room and you give a little spray, and then you very calmly walk to the other side of the room, At first, you won't smell it on the other side of the room, because all of those molecules of perfume or Lysol are concentrated in that one area. Now, you don't have to do anything but stand on the other side of the room. And eventually, those molecules that were in such a high concentration in the corner will, without any help from you, spread out throughout the whole room. Because they will move from an area of high concentration to areas of low concentration until they reach an equilibrium, and then everywhere in the room has those molecules. So at first, in the corner where you sprayed it was an area of high concentration of Lysol or perfume. And then you went to the other side and you didn't smell it, and then sooner or later it made it to your side. That's diffusion. That's moving from high concentration to low. Now, in the cell, there are some things that will just move through the cell membrane in this way. And oxygen and carbon dioxide are two of these molecules. They are small enough that they will just move through the membrane without any help. They will just diffuse through. If there is a higher concentration inside than out, then those molecules will just move out, and vice versa. Okay. Now, because we are talking about human cells and not Lysol and perfume, there is a very specific process for, and because water, I guess that we should say that water is such an important molecule for life, there is a very specific process for diffusion of water, and that is called osmosis. And osmosis is diffusion of water from areas of high concentration to low. So if there is an area of high concentration of water outside the cell, then inside the cell, the water will move into the cell from the outside. And the same is true. And it's important for our cells to have an equilibrium of water inside and out, so they do not shrink or burst. And we'll talk about in class and test in class this week scenarios where the cell will shrink and will burst. What can you put a cell in that will cause it to water to rush in and cause that cell to swell? And then what environment can you put that cell in that will cause all the water to leave the cell and cause the cell to shrink? This is something that we can test in class, and we will be testing this week. The transport of water and other biological molecules across this membrane is absolutely essential to living things. And so that's why kind of separating the cell membrane from the other organelles was important. Needing that oxygen and water and glucose for cellular respiration, needing to package those proteins and get them out of the cell is all part of kind of our biological processes that keep us alive. And so understanding how that happens is important. Diffusion and osmosis, these two specific processes, they are considered passive transport. And this is important to note because they require no energy. So there's no ATP required to get oxygen into the cell or carbon dioxide out. And thank goodness, because really we need so much of that that it would not make any sense if we had to expend energy to bring in oxygen to make energy. Like, I think you can sort of see how that wouldn't really make sense for life. We need oxygen to break down glucose for energy. So to need energy to get the oxygen doesn't really make sense. So these don't require any energy. Life knows better. This is passive transport. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water will move in and out of the membrane without the use of ATP. There is another type of diffusion that does not require energy, but it does require a little more help. And this is called facilitated diffusion. So to facilitate something is to help it along. And so whereas oxygen, carbon dioxide are small enough molecules that they don't need help, sugar molecules are larger. Okay, glucose is C6H12O6. That's obviously a bigger molecule than O2, so it needs a little bit of help. It's too large to move freely across the membrane. So what we have proteins in the cell membrane that create channels to facilitate the movement of these through. This is still passive transport. Now, why I'm stressing this is because protein channels are also used for a different type of transport that requires energy. But facilitated diffusion does not require energy. Again, I'd say this is very important because the sugar is glucose. Okay, so it again doesn't make sense if it takes energy to bring the stuff in you use to make energy. It would be like making energy just to get the supplies to make the energy. And so facilitated diffusion helps bring these larger molecules across without the use of energy. Now, the opposite of this is active transport. So active transport requires energy. Okay, these are when we need to move things that aren't naturally going from high areas of concentration to low areas of concentration. This will move things from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. Now, if you remember, diffusion and osmosis, they moved from areas of high concentration to low. Active transport can move from low concentrations to high. This requires ATP. So when those proteins are packaged and need to leave the cell, this requires energy to happen, because there isn't this thing where there are more proteins out than in or more proteins in than out, so we got to move them. We need to just move these proteins outside of the cell, and in order to do that, we need cell energy to make that happen. And so these transport proteins are what help that happen. And here's an image of all of them. Here we have diffusion, and we could say diffusion, this would be for O2, CO2, and then we have H2O, which is osmosis, okay? And then we have, you can see here we have no protein, we have no protein channel, nothing. The only thing we have here are these molecules move from high concentration down through the membrane to low concentration. You can also see right here is our double phospholipid membrane. You'll always see that. This is a good example of sort of the 3 different ways we can move things across the membrane, okay? Then we have facilitated diffusion. This is for our sugars. You can see you don't see any use of energy here, but we do have a protein channel that will move the sugars through. So no need for energy. We're still moving from higher concentrations to low. And then over here we have, and this again is, these are both passive. Okay. And then over here, whenever we see ATP, we know that that's cell energy, and so this is active transport. Okay. And this requires cell energy. We're moving particles, larger particles in and out of the cell, and we're not relying on concentration to have that happen. We're not relying on areas of high and low concentration for that to happen. Okay, exocytosis. Exocytosis is a type of active transport, which means it needs energy. Exo means out, and when the cell needs to get rid of something, it can use this process of exocytosis. And a vesicle will surround whatever needs to be secreted, and then that vesicle can kind of fuse itself to the cell membrane, and then the cell membrane will open up and the molecules are emptied to the outside of the cell into that extracellular fluid. So this whole process here needs energy. So that vesicle surrounds whatever molecule needs to leave, and then that vesicle can fuse to the cell membrane, and then the cell membrane can open and release the molecule out to the outside of the cell. The opposite process of this is called endocytosis, and endo means in, so there are some things from the outside of the cell that the cell needs. And what the cell membrane can do is it can engulf this particle, can stretch around this particle, and then the membrane can fuse back together, and then bring the particle into the cell. So this also is active transport and requires energy in order for it to happen. Okay, so that's that. This week we're going to be doing a lab called egg osmosis, and so we're going to be looking at the process of osmosis in a chicken egg, and this lab requires an entire week, so I'll get it started and make observations and collect data, and this will be kind of the jumping off point for our weekly discussions. So thank you very much.